Hi, this is Paul. I'm continuing on with my commentary on the Jordan Peterson Exodus series. I hope this is of some value to you. If it is, just let me know in the comment section because that helps me know. Now, I hope to get through at least episode 1. I've written the Daily Wire to just get any insight into what they're going to do. I would hate to put up a whole bunch of episodes on Exodus on the second episode and then get copyright strikes and those kinds of things. So we'll see what Daily Wire has to say. Daily Wire, when Jordan Peterson came under contract with them, they have the rights to this material. So it's really up to them what I can and can't use, but I'm going to soldier on and at least get through, maybe we'll get through episode 1 right now. So here we go.
Egyptian and the Hebrew structure there, because he's serving this priest of Midian and tending his flock very there. For mayhem, for purposes of the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Another indication of him being subservient to an ethical structure outside both the Egyptian and the Hebrew structure there, because he's serving this priest of Midian. And
part of the biggest issues we deal with today are pluralism. And so, and these issues aren't unknown to the Bible. Pluralism was just sort of dealt with in different ways, with polytheism sort of built into it a way of dealing with pluralism, and you find this often in the book of Genesis. Of course, you have Melchizedek. Melchizedek figure gets picked up later in the book of Hebrews. This is a priest of Midian. We had the midwives to the Hebrews as sort of God-fearers. So there's sort of this interesting dealing with particularity and universality as we go.
Tending his flock, that also makes Moses a figure that transcends the parochial confines of his culture, another indication of that. And he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And so God here is associated with the mountain, and so you could riff on that.
Okay, now it's helpful to note, just for that Horeb, this appears to be a synonym for Sinai. It is the name used in the e-documents, so the document hypothesis, which I tend to avoid. The name is transparently derived from a root signifying dryness, which means a parched mountain. Abraham Ibn Ezra acutely notes that this parched desert location is 3 days' journey from the Nile, the great source of water. That contrast points to a spatial thematic antithesis. Moses, the man associated with water from infancy, now encounters God of all creation in the dry desert and in the flame.
And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire, this compelling and attractive fire phenomenon, out of the midst of a bush.
Now Jordan had a really interesting conversation. I'll have to find it. I don't know the timing of both of these, but he talked about this theophany. I mentioned it in a video that I did on that. It was this conversation with Dr. Robin Carthout Harris, but I believe it was in the Daily Wire part of it. And part of these, sometimes some of the best parts of these conversations are in the Daily Wire section. And of course, I can't pull them out and use them and really bring them to you. But Jordan talked about some of the same issues that he talked about here in the Exodus seminar about light and shining and fire.
And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses...
That's the symbol Jews often use for the Jewish people. We're always burned, but we're not consumed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the question is, in a situation like that, just exactly what's being burned away. One of the reasons that the Transcendent is terrifying and why people purified themselves, for example, before they engaged in psychedelic experiences historically, was because if they got too close to the fire, the burning that produced was so intense that it might be of mortal danger. If you're 95% dead wood.
Well, of course, you have the vision of Isaiah in Isaiah 6. I'm a unholy, I'm an unholy man living in the midst of an unholy people. And of course, the angel comes and touches his lips. I should probably just read the passage. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, and each had 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their face, with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 wings they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. God number 2. The whole earth is full of his glory. God number 1. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I have lived among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his mouth, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With this he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips, and your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. And then go and tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding, be ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused and their ears dull, and close their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. And of course Jesus quotes this.
And you get too close to the fire, all that dead wood should go, but it might be fatal. So
you were mentioning the whole heroic side of faith, or I think you were, in fact. There's also this terrifying aspect of the deity linked to transcendence and the absoluteness, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, as Otto described it, this mystery that is both repelling because it's terrifying and at the same time attractive. And I think that was obviously...
Well, we get some echoes of that.
This is, what he just, Rudolf Otto's book on this. This is what so often strikes me of so much New Age spirituality. It's so unreal because it lacks exactly this. God is not Disneyland. God is not a playground. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. Again, both of these sort of kept together.
And I would say in contact with things of great beauty. The European cathedrals are like that. Mm. I was in one in Vienna recently that had 3 floors of plague bones underneath it. And so it's this magnificent structure, too much really, when you walk in, and it's overwhelming in its power. And to see that, people sacrificed hundreds of years of effort under conditions of extreme privation to build these magnificent buildings, and then to go underneath and see the layers and layers and layers of catastrophe and death that's been erected on. It's too much, right? It's just too much. And that's just an echo of what is too much in the most fundamentally absolute sense. It's just a pointer in that direction. People are terrified of beauty for the same reason. I've watched people respond to art. I had a lot of paintings in my house at one point. They're all coming back now. Like 300 of them, it was just paintings everywhere. And people would come in and say, well, why would you want to live in a museum? And I'd think, well, that's exactly where I want to live. Why would you not want to live? But it was too much. The paintings, a lot of them were paintings of warfare scenes, and they were beautiful, but they weren't nice. It wasn't elevator music, and you look at those things and they shake all the weakness.
It's a classic, intense Jordan Peterson.
Off of you if you look at them long enough, and that's very frightening, especially if there's lots of weakness, and there definitely is.
So it's interesting, is it not, that in our culture, where you might say there's been
I like some of these behind the back camera shots. Usually there's just sort of at the face around the table, but I like some of these behind the back shots.
Systematic ideological process of desecration, that there's also been an aversion to beauty.
Yeah, that's not accidental.
The philosopher Roger Scruton.
Generica, right?
Yeah.
The spread of, exactly, the spread of these cookie cutter suburbs everywhere that have this they're efficient in some sense and they're convenient, but they're just hideous. And they have this very short-term element. And, Yeah, and you see this contempt for that too. It's really terrifying to see it in Europe, because as a North American, especially a Canadian, going to Europe has this element of pilgrimage to beauty. And you go, I saw this in Edinburgh in particular, although they're fixing it. Edinburgh, the whole downtown core, 1 square mile is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and no wonder, because Edinburgh is like, it's beautiful. And then intermingled with these mostly Victorian buildings, if I remember correctly, were these hideous catastrophes erected in the 1970s, this brutalist, modernist abortion, these giant middle fingers, you know, to the entire context. And to their credit, the people of Edinburgh are tearing them down. And yeah.
My mentor.
Well, one of the interesting points there about beauty is one of the big struggles in our culture right now is this whole question of hierarchy, that often people say, well, no, there can't be any hierarchy. Of course, Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron, if you've never read that, it's a short piece. It's very much worth your reading, because basically, if you don't have hierarchy, you can't have beauty, because beauty always comes in a hierarchy. And if there's beautiful, and there's that which isn't as beautiful, and that which is acknowledged as being less than beautiful. I mentioned this recently in a video. Freddie DeBoer's really quite dramatic piece, the prologue to the anti-therapeutic, anti-affirmation movement, where basically he just really nails it in this. Currently, an inescapable American cultural mode, particularly among the educated, is one of mandatory therapeutic maximalism and attendant tyranny of affirmation. The therapeutic affirmation mode assumes wanting and not getting is disordered and a kind of identity crisis. There can be no one more beautiful than myself. Ironically, with this is the fact that is in fact the Luciferian vision. You find it in Snow White, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all, and then I have to kill them. Envy is what bubbles out of the heart. Human life is meant to be spent in a ceaseless state of feeling valid, which is to say affirmed and respected and paid attention to and liked. Any deviation from this state of pathological and vestige of injustice. Good people spend a great deal of their time categorically and uncritically affirming others, telling friends and strangers alike that their desires are all legitimate, their instincts always correct, their perceptions of their own needs never mistaken or misguided, their self-conception compelling. Correspondingly, we should all assume that anyone who is not affirming us is necessarily doing so out of a particular kind of politicized wickedness, that they are likely motivated by racism, sexism, homophobia, or other kinds of bigotry, and as if specific accusations are not plausible, then by simple evil. C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory talks about the specific pleasure of the inferior. It's the pleasure of, and again, when you look at Jordan Peterson, when he talks about what, sort of the male-female dynamic in the hierarchy, men push each other up different hierarchies. We celebrate someone who is better than ourselves, and that's really important, and women sort of peel off the top. This is I'm not saying women don't have spaces and ways that they do this too, but this beauty is, at some point as a human being, to turn from idolatry, you have to acknowledge that I am lesser and I will worship one who is greater because they are worthy of praise. Oops, other tab.
Peter Berger has a notion, signals of transcendence. Mm-hmm. Some are positive, beauty, or C.S. Lewis surprised by joy. Mm-hmm. Some are negative, like the Auden one. This, to me, is the ultimate signal of transcendence ever. Because if you look at burning, mm-hmm. it must end in ashes. Mm-hmm.
And you can't look away from fire either. Like we
Nothing
are the
lasts.
apes who couldn't
Everything
look away
changes.
from fire.
You can't step in the same river twice. If you just go that way, you'd end up with a Hindu view of Maya, mm-hmm. and the world's unreal. Mm-hmm. And yet, no, here's something burning, but not burned up.
Right, that's us, man. That's
Well,
us.
no, there's something beyond us, and he's arrested. He sees it, and then he seeks for the explanation, and immediately he encounters the Lord. And that's why, Dennis, the Jews themselves are the ultimate, because of your survival. Despite persecution, you shouldn't be here. The way
Some shouldn't.
you know what I'm saying.
Just forgive me. I shouldn't
Now
have
you're in
allowed
trouble.
that out. Yes.
Now you're in trouble.
I'm thinking of Trotsky and the like. I just there's some
Well, to jump
unimpressive Jews.
to jump from the Hebraic to the Hellenic, that's not far off the way Plato uses the image of fire in his famous image of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic. You know, the flames are flickering, but that's not all there is. There's transcendence beyond. There's the sunlight, the stable, timeless sunlight outside the cave, which the sort of chaotic fire of the sensory world and the fickle world, the ever-changing world, but it's a signal of transcendence, as Berger puts it. And it's an interesting sort of consonance there.
Well, fire is also this mysterium tremendum and fascinance that you described, because I think biologically, and I'll think about this from an evolutionary perspective, we're all descendants of the first proto-human chimpanzee analog who absolutely 100% could not stop looking at fire. Right, and fire is absolutely fascinating to human beings. It's so interesting to watch people around a campfire, for example, where we feel at home. We gaze into the fire, and the fire seems to me to be something that escapes what's called latent inhibition, is that almost everything we see after we've seen it multiple times, we see as a representation of memory. We don't see the thing itself, but fire is one of those things that escapes that, and we see fire as something that's constantly new, plus it's
That is such a cool point.
always constantly changing, and we cannot look away from it, just like we can't look away from little children, and we can't look away from sexual beauty. These things all escape the tyranny of our conceptualization. So
I just wanted to say something about these two. Like, to me, these two texts, the one you read before and this one, is really one of the most a very beautiful description of reality, based a little bit on what you were saying before, because it says, and God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. First of all, this is also referring to Genesis at the end of the flood, because that's how the flood ends. The flood ends, it says, God remembered Noah. And when God remembers Noah, the waters recede, and then the dove finds the tree, finds the structure that connects heaven and earth. That's what the dove finds. And so you have this verse, but right there it says, he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for the first time, you have this hierarchy again coming back, saying God is already giving back the identity to his people. He's already saying, it's like it's not just God and chaos. There's this whole story that's there, and he's going to give it back to his people. And then Moses, so
is that Jacob's ladder? Do you think is that the
definitely
same imagery?
it's definitely
that
Jacob's ladder,
intermediary
the
structure.
mountain, and the tabernacle itself. When we get to the tabernacle, you'll see it's a
I think that probably confuses some people when Jordan said that, but it's the connecting Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now Moses. It's the connecting of the story. Remember what I said in the last video when early on Peugeot says, it's the filling up of the middle. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. This is through the words, through the naming. I wanted to again bring up this book. This book gets a lot into naming. It's a short book. It won't take you long at all to read it. The print is big, so if you've got aging eyes like mine, you don't even need cheater glasses or anything like that. It's terrific. But so it's like Jacob's ladder. It's once again drawing the connection, once again connecting God with his people. Now, of course, when they get to Sinai, God, of course, will come. And the question of Exodus is, how can a holy God live in the midst of an unholy people? This is the issue that is still there with Isaiah. It's the constant tension of Israel, the burning bush, as Dennis Prager said. But what will happen then is the tabernacle will be sort of the nexus point, and of course the tabernacle will be replaced by the temple, and of course for Christians the temple then becomes the church, not necessarily in terms of buildings, but in terms of the community of the people, the Protestant that I am.
Representation of Moses' mountain itself, or the mountain of paradise itself. So then Moses, right after that, you have Moses, what happens? He comes out of the desert, come to a mountain, and in that mountain, now he's...
And again, this is 3 days, as I talked about with Robert Alter, and so Egypt is water, 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 and now he's going to dry, dry, dry. And this is the journey. Again, it's a 3-day journey. What other number would it be?
Sees this flaming bush. He has to remove his sandals. He enters into the sacred space. The sacred space is the text. At least I know St. Gregory of Nyssa really insists on how the bush is a bramble bush. It's a thorn bush. And that's you can see that's the fullness of everything, because the thorns are the consequence of the fall. The thorns are what God gives as a consequence of sin. And now here is this thorn bush, which is full of light, but is not consumed. And that's the thing. That's what God gives us. It's like reality can exist in all its multiplicity, in all its beauty. And we don't, as Christians and people also in the Hebrew tradition, we don't have this idea that the world is an illusion, that the world is just has to be gotten rid of, and we just need to get to nirvana or whatever. We have this sense that the world...
John is speaking against some of the there's a sea mammal out there. I think it's the glory. I think it's a seal. I saw him last night out there, and I should maybe show you what I'm looking at. Do the full camera. Yeah, it says, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory." So often at the end of the summer, my wife is a school teacher, and so she's getting nervous about getting prepped for school, and I'm trying to get some vacation in, and so we have these weird, they're sort of work rest trips that we make, and so that's why I'm making videos in this place that is just full of God's glory. But Peugeot sort of pushing back on some Gnosticism in evangelicalism and Protestantism, that the earth is just thrown away. No, it's in the midst of I love the point that he made there. It's in the midst of the thorns. Remember in Genesis, the thorns are part of the curse, how the earth is cursed. The man, Adam, isn't cursed. The earth is cursed. And thorns and thistles will frustrate you. And there in the middle of the frustration is the holy God. And this, I think, is, I was working on my sermon today, working through Paul's sort of the end of miracles and Paul's journey into the cruciform. And that, of course, is where Jesus is seen, where he then is, in a sense, he's the cursed one upon the tree, but he is also the righteousness. It just all comes together in him.
The world is full of God's presence, and it's a gift, right? It's good. That's what it says at the beginning of Genesis. I think that's what we're seeing here, is this God is present in the world. God is manifesting himself to Moses, but he's not consuming it. It's continuously continuing to exist even in its participation in God.
And I read that so Moses has to take his sandals off to go to do this. I read that that's also his, and this is on Commentary on the Torah, that he was foregoing any claim to ownership of the land upon which he stood. There were ancient Hebrew traditions about taking ownership of land that had to do with being shod. And so to take off the shoes meant to approach the transcendent in a humble way with no claim to possession. And that seems to me, and the shoes, of course, are symbols of identity. Tammy, my wife, she had dreams all the time where shoes represented her current identity. So, all right.
That's fascinating. I had never heard either of those points.
And the angel of Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. This is at least a great mystery. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called him unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place
By the way,
whereon...
the only redundancy in God's entire dialogue in the Bible,
is...
take your shoes off your feet.
And so
Just
why...
a cute, meaningless point, but I've always gotten a kick out of it. Where else are your shoes if not on your feet?
From off thy feet.
Yes.
Like, where else
Right.
is
Just
it?
take off your shoes would have sufficed.
Is that in the Hebrew?
Yes. Yes. It struck me as a kid. Where else are his shoes? I don't.
Well, it also means I think that God is insisting that in some real sense Moses stands unprotected and naked in front of him, and because to take off your shoes is and to reveal your feet, that might account for why that emphasis is there, right? And so it's the feet and not the shoes. And the shoes are definitely, I mean, they're a fundamental element of culture, and they shield us from our contact with the ground, but they also, in some real sense, elevate us above the ground, right? That's the danger of shoes. We're no longer in contact with the earth.
Again, you know, I'm so thankful for these, because there's a little point I never would have thought of. I mean, and these are why Jordan's this series is so potent, because of all these little points. Now, often a lot of the other points that are made, you can read commentaries, and there's lots of points in the commentary, and it's not just novelty, but no, it's just so good.
There's a lack of humility by putting on those garments of skin, and we feel invulnerable in a way
That's
that we're
what they
really
are.
Oh, he's learned from Peugeot.
not.
I think the best way to understand this text is as a return to Eden. And so in order to return to Eden,
Right.
he has to remove his garments of skin. And it's like, but what's crazy is the surprise. It's like he removes his garments of skin, and the surprise is to see the thorn bush in flame. It's like, what a crazy mystery. Like, what a...
Well, and
That's such a fresh insight. Now, maybe people who've been reading the Church Fathers will say, "Oh, this is all in St. Gregory of Nyssa, and you haven't read that." And good, so good point. I do have a little while ago. IVP put out a series of Church Fathers commentary, and where they take these bits from the Church Fathers. Oh, I seem to be up a little high. They take these bits from the Church Fathers and kind of put them all with the text so you can read them. And they're I often go and read them when I'm doing my sermon work.
It's an echo then too of the notion that in order to encounter the transcendent in the most real sense, you have to absolutely and 100% accept your naked vulnerability. And you think, well, that's self-evident when you think it through, because how else could you adapt to life in the most fundamental sense without simultaneously accepting the fact that you're ultimately, right, naked and vulnerable. You're ultimately that, because you're prone to insanity, you're prone to tyranny, and you're prone to death. There isn't any more ultimate on the human plane than that. And so if you can't adapt to that and accept it, then you can't adapt to or accept life. So...
You think that's a big reason, any of you, why so many people have rejected God? They're not prepared to accept their vulnerability?
Oh, yes.
I don't know. I'm truly asking.
This is where some of these, why so many people have rejected God. I don't know that our dance with secularity is quite that binary. And I'm not discounting or denying that so many people have rejected God. That is in fact, but it's, I gotta think about this a minute. Many have rejected institutions, God's church, religious organizations, and tried not to reject God, although that isn't so as easily done as people imagine it is. I think it goes. What strikes me about that question here is that we've just talked about how terrifying God is, and that we as humanity are stuck in this in between, where on one side we can't live God and we can't live without Him, and we're right there in the midst. And yes, part of it is the vulnerability. We are scared, and we should be scared. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But Prager, who has many great points through this, he says this, and it's like, ooh. And again, I want to be careful with this, because I have said many times that I don't. An honest question is always welcome in a Bible study. So I don't want to be too harsh on this, but in the context of this passage, I was just surprised by this question.
I had not thought of it in this way.
Well, I think that the rejection, in some sense, of the travails of the saints and the prophets and the crucifix is definitely its rejection of the catastrophe of mortality. Because all of those traditions call on us, and you see this as a clinician. One of the things that clinicians learned across all the different schools of clinical psychology was that the more radically you accept the necessity of confronting what you're terrified of and wish to avoid, the higher the probability that you'll move forward and recover.
That's an amazing statement. That's an amazing statement. And again, this is why people are like, oh, Jordan on Twitter, blah, 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 blah. This is why I pay attention to these things. This is why I pay attention to him here, because he brings out points like this that are, because I know that as a pastor, but to see it, I still have this from yesterday from doing this with respect to the new atheist challenge that this is all arbitrary. No, it's not arbitrary, because you see it played out in real life over and over. You see it confirmed all over the place. That's why this text continues to echo through the world. That's why people of all different levels of intellectual ability go back to it. If this is a point that I make again and again, but I go back to it in Van Auken's A Severe Mercy. It's not a book written by C.S. Lewis, but he was a friend of C.S. Lewis, and there's a lot of quotes from C.S. Lewis in it, because C.S. Lewis wrote this guy letters. And one of the points that C.S. Lewis made when C.S. Lewis, he first became a theist, but then he was sort of on the precipice between Hinduism and Christianity, and the reason that he thought Christianity the most true was, in fact, its scalability, that it can be practiced by the humble farmer and the intellectual and the monk, and even the person who has little affection or ability for the sacred spaces. And that's one of the challenges of Protestantism is, in fact, scalability. Now, I think Protestantism has addressed it quite well over the last 500 years, and of course, addressed some issues that were in Catholicism. But this point that we see it verified again and again in different ways, so just a tremendous point made by Jordan.
And we don't know the limit to that, right? And the Christian question, in some real sense, is the limit to that. It's like, well, how deep into the abyss do you have to look? And the answer is not only into death, but beyond death, into hell. Because if death is what terrifies you the most, you know nothing about hell, because there are many things worse than death. And so the call is to gaze into the abyss as far down as it goes, and that's all the way to the bottom.
But that basic state of vulnerability, of fragility, it does conjure up a sense of finitude, I think, in the human experience. Finitude and dependence, and a sense of lack, a sense that we are not, in the end, masters and captains of our soul. And
that's the truth. I mean, one of the real problems with, let's put it back to Dennis Prager's idea, running away from God is, okay, what are you running to? At any given, I had, my father dropped dead of a heart attack at 77. My sister dropped dead of a heart attack, leaving her, her 3 young adult children and her husband at 53. Tomorrow, my wife and I are going to get back in our car and start making our way back down to Sacramento. And anything along that way can take our lives in a moment. Now, we live in this amazing time and place where we have where we have security and prosperity at a scale that no other civilization has ever had. I remember, I've told this story again too. I remember doing a study in a coffee picking community up in the hills over the town that I lived in the Dominican Republic, and I was looking around at all of the adults in the room, and they were all parents. You become a parent quite young often there, and some of those families could get very large. And I asked them, how many of you have lost a child before that child turned 5? Every single person in that room raised their hand. And until into the 20th century, that would have been true. My grandfather had a sister who was under 10 when she died of, I think, diphtheria in the United States. Life, we are small, we are fragile. We live on this edge, and that is who we are. And yes, it's Tim Keller once had this quote that every time we get up in the morning, we should all just be absolutely terrified because our life might end that day, and we're just completely oblivious to it. And again, the answer isn't to make us more cautious; it's to give us more courage.
We require an orientation to something greater, something on which we do depend.
Finite,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And also, I think we have a particular crisis at the moment. I think we can see this in the universities with the so-called mental health crisis. And it's linked to this assumption that human beings should be happy. And if they're not, there's something wrong with them. And our ancestors grew up with the tenet that life is extremely difficult, and that a path to happiness is extremely demanding.
And
So yesterday I did a video that most of you won't see because it was about Christian Reformed church history or Dutch American church history. And I'm sure if I had a YouTube coach, they would tell me, don't make videos about obscure topics that nobody's going to want to watch, like the obscure sort of magazine that comes out of the basement of the library of Calvin University that pays attention to the minutia of your tradition. But the point they're making, this episode, you can see this on the cover of the video where I treated it, and sorry for the repetition, but I'll read it again. Albertus van Raalte was in many ways the founder of Dutch American immigration in the middle of the 19th century. And this has letters to his son, and his son Dirk didn't marry as soon as Van Raalte thought he should, and he hadn't joined a church as Van Raalte thought he should. And you have these letters from a father to a son. And I read a portion of this letter, and I'll read a portion again. It makes the point that that they were just making here. And this is Van Raalte reading the news. I read that Disraeli, former Premier of England, now Gladstone's opponent and perhaps England's new Premier, in describing man's life said, "Youth is a blunder, manhood a wrestling, old age a disappointment." And when I read that, I thought, how different from what anyone would dare say in let's say, the manosphere these days. Why does this statement contain so much truth, Vinralti writes? Because our spiritual nature is not intended to be a slave of the visible and tangible things, but to be ruler over them as God's viceroy and image bearer. As long as man did not wrench himself from God, his source, the whole creation lay at his feet to devote it to the glory of his God, losing sight of its origin and life's purpose and of the Creator's claims upon him. Man acquired a different purpose in life. Man enthroned himself instead of God and thus devoted to the realm of the universe to himself. Part of this other book, I don't have a world of books behind me. I got to use the materials I got, but they are easily at hand. Part of what the Inklings were about. So you have Barfield, who is the oldest and longest lived, the first and the last Inkling, but also Tolkien and Lewis. There's a great book on Tolkien and Lewis in light of the First World War. Both of them World War I veterans. Both of them, many see the World War I as sort of the beginning of the end of modernity, the beginning of the end that science and rationality can sort of, with those things, we can make the world as we want it to be. And what Tolkien and Lewis and Barfield were all yearning for would be what they would say the real world, the world behind the world, the layer at which the truths transcend the particularities of this world. And for this reason, in our day and age, we might glorify, and I'm sitting in this beautiful hotel room very much enjoying this, I'll show it again, enjoying this absolutely majestic, glorious view. And, my wife and I expended more than we usually do, but we're celebrating our 35th wedding anniversary, and I think that's a worthwhile thing to celebrate. But to hear someone today say, don't get too attached to the earthly things. Well, if you're a new atheist, that's all you have are the earthly things. And so you have this natural bent to hedonism. Or maybe you will aspire to C.S. Lewis dealt with all of these things and sort of mocked them. Live for posterity. Why? Is that rational? Does it make sense? And we're sitting atop a tradition that says, yeah, happiness is a beautiful thing. And when you're blessed with it, you should praise God for it. But don't be confused about what life in this world is. And I remember Jonathan Haidt's happiness hypothesis. And one of my takeaways from that book, that was probably a pre-IDW book that I read, because I discovered Jonathan Haidt, and I had read his the book that made him popular on sort of the underpinnings of political polarization. And then I said, well, what else has he written? And the happiness hypothesis, which I thought was a better book, but he talked about the cortical lottery. I'm high in openness and I'm low in negative emotions just by virtue of things I cannot take credit for. The godliness of my parents, the particularities of my temperament. I am a happy person. I will probably in my life have been far more happy than the vast majority of human beings who ever lived. Through absolute, and I can take no credit for that. And there are other people who will be miserable and they should take absolutely no responsibility for their misery because it was inflicted by others, or maybe they just had a temperament that leads to melancholy. Back to the video.
Unbelievably,
Happiness is extremely demanding.
and also unbelievably unlikely, right? And you should be grateful when it comes along, but by no means expect it. And then they had a noble vision too on the Roman and the Greek and the Hebrew front, which was not so much hedonic happiness, which is very trivial. And Solzhenitsyn says, well, that disappears when you first hear the boots kicking down your door at 3 a.m. It's like so much.
And read Tolstoy on it as well. I mean, Tolstoy's Confession is a very, very interesting book if you've never read it.
Much for happiness, that's gone. And then what do you have? And well, that was Frankl's question and Solzhenitsyn's question. And part of the answer to that is, in the face of privation and terror and tragedy and malevolence, you have the great adventure of your life. And one of the things that I think is true is that you find that adventure in truth, because truth is an adventure, and it might be enough of an adventure. It might be enough of an adventure to justify the catastrophe and malevolence of life.
And I wonder whether the erosion of certain basic rituals is also generating a lot of problems. I mean, a trivial, well, not trivial example, but one that comes to my mind was a death in college about 20 years ago of a brilliant young student who was hit by a car crossing the road in the college. And I noticed that the students, the 18, 19-year-old students, were completely thrown by this. And partly it emerged they hadn't been to funerals. Their parents hadn't taken them along to funerals.
Right, to shelter them.
To protect them from suffering. And they'd say, as good parents, they wouldn't.
I remember when we had a lot of little pets for our kids, and the thing about little pets is they die. Little mouse, guinea pigs, they die. And I've had many tearful services around a little guinea pig's burial plot. Guinea pigs, of course, food for South Americans. But and I knew parents who would, if the guinea pig would die, they would try to go out and find a guinea pig that looked like it to do a switch, so that our culture has lost so much wisdom.
Not them from suffering, and they'd say, as good parents, they would not allow their children to be subjected to funerals, as if the funerals might be damaging them. Now, what I noticed was, in fact, that you had adults, young adults, highly intelligent adults, who were completely disorientated and distraught by death, and I think to some extent because the ritual of funerals.
Well, there's no container for it. Well, my wife remembers when she was 5, her grandfather died, and they didn't take her to the funeral. Now, my wife's parents, by the way, were very good at fostering independence, but they didn't take her to the funeral, and she was shocked by that and never forgot it. And I think the reason is that the message there is that death itself is so terrifying that there's no way a child can apprehend it or bear up under it. And that better not be the case, because that's life, death. And so if that's the case, then life is too much. And so what you do is you bring the child to the funeral to show that. So when my wife's mother died, we were there for her death. And it was a terrible death. She had a neurological disease, a degenerative neurological disease, dementia. So she deteriorated over about 15 years. And first of all, her husband rose to the challenge. Man, it was something to see, because he was sort of a man about town, but when the chips were down, God, he was there. And it was something, man. And then I watched her family.
So it's not too long before this in the show, but it was the last one when they talk about theodicy. And this is one of the ironies of suffering, that it's the suffering in the world, and it's the deprivation, and it's the challenge, and it's the struggles that creates the heroism and creates a certain kind of beauty. And many have noted that if not for, again, to go back to Freddie de Boer's piece, if in fact humanity was able to pull off this anti-therapeutic world, things insta-therapy won't tell you. Sometimes it's your fault. You might not love yourself completely. Self-esteem comes from esteemable acts. Emotional regulation requires discipline. Some pain isn't healed. You learn to live with it. Coddling is just as bad as neglect. Narcissism, self-focus isn't healing. And then the last one is just cynical. I think you do need to look for a savior. And because what you see around you is that it's funny, because when you look at our art and you look at and what we do with movies, we love heroes. We love saviors. We can't get enough of them. And part of what we saw is that we're so quick in this in this society to cheapen heroism. On one hand, we should esteem the parents who sacrifice for the child. We should esteem the police officer who puts his life on the line for the community. We should esteem the firefighter, the soldier, the nurse, the teacher. All of these people are worthy of esteem because they put themselves at risk and sometimes sacrifice themselves for others and even the stranger. So
deal with this. They're pretty tough. My wife's sister is a palliative care nurse, and her other sister is a pharmacist, and they've confronted mortality, in a noble sense. And what happened in that family was that as they mutually faced death together, and this is also what you do at a funeral, is the bonds that attached them to each other grew stronger and thicker. And so that while they suffered the loss of their mother, which was a genuine loss, they were compensated for it in a real sense by the increase in love between them. And I would say their family, in the aftermath of their mother's death, was much closer and tighter than it was before. And, you can't say...
Recently on Voices, someone posted a piece, I guess Hillary Clinton, I know just saying the name will lead to certain things. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, off they go. Wrote a piece about loneliness. And it's like, what do we have to do about loneliness? Well, why don't we stop infantilizing people and give them a chance to rise to the occasion rather than... I've seen so many people who've been disabled by bad parenting.
Well, that made it good because that's a cheap out, But you can bloody well say that it made it a lot less like hell than it had to be. And so these containing rituals, your children are a lot tougher than people think, and you need to take them to a funeral.
Not just rituals, but commitments, containing commitments. Parents to children, spouses to each other, individuals to institutions and communities where they're needed to stand and take a hit and sacrifice for the well-being of everyone else.
So that they can see that the adults, I'm going to be like Dad, and look, he can stand up in the face of death, maybe even in the face of the death of his father, and he can still move forward. And God, you better learn that because it's coming down the pipelines.
But the text is, this text is precisely such a ritual, right? This isn't a live stream of history, right?
I said Andrew Blackwood instead of Stephen Blackwood. But again, he speaks the least, but he almost always has something really valuable to say.
This is a text written to convey, you might say, the order in history or God's...
He speaks so little, they don't even have a camera on him or one ready to go for him.
The transcendent order in history and to bring us into that history. And so, when you talk about the ritual of the funeral, for example, that's a ritual to help you understand the horror of death and to, in some sense, redeem it, at least from the point of view of your own self-consciousness, to be able to understand it. And so I think, when you see these moments that refer to God remembering his covenant and so on, this is in a way showing us that the text is itself a liturgical creation of our own subjectivity, our own memories, such that we can make sense of our lives here and now.
Well, I just want to ask Jordan a question. It intrigued me what you said about your mother's father. It was bon vivant,
yeah,
and then rose to the challenge.
Man, it was unreal.
Right. So I want to ask you a question. Prior to the challenge, what would you have predicted his behavior would have been?
Well, I always liked him and admired him, but he was a man about town, extroverted guy.
So
I had no idea.
He passed the test, and you would have predicted he would have passed the test.
Not to the degree that he did. It was really quite stunning.
So here's my question, and it's really, I wrestle with it. I don't have an answer. I am curious to hear anyone on this. Do we know people before they have been tested?
No, not really. We don't know ourselves either.
Then this is a very, very interesting.
This is a great point. It's a great section.
Question. because life in America, at least, from World War II to the last, till 2010 even years ago, was quite easy for the vast majority of its citizens.
Mm-hmm. By any reasonable historical standard.
Exactly, yeah, which is the only standard, obviously. So is it fair to say we don't know the moral caliber of most of the people living in?
It's a great point, and it's a great question, but it does sort of, people are going to say, well, there's the Korean War, there's the Vietnam War, there's the wars of the Middle East. So we have had wars, but we've had far fewer soldiers in those wars. But we have had, well, this is part of the value of making and keeping commitments, because if you become a parent, you will be tested. If you become a spouse, you will be tested. If you join a religious organization, you will be tested. If you take on a job of responsibility, you will be tested. Now we might not have all faced the tests of the trenches of the First World War, or the beaches of Normandy, or the death of a child, but there are plenty of ways that we get tested today.
In America, because I think people have been tested in the last 2 years, and I think half of my fellow citizens failed dismally, especially doctors, I might add.
I know some doctors who would probably agree.
Well, wasn't it Hemingway who said that every generation needs a war to sort out what's important? And
it's a very dark thought.
Yes. Well, it's more, maybe, William James would have said something like a war or its moral equivalent. And that was something James...
Right, or its moral equivalent.
Yeah,
right.
Well, because you have...
Well, that's what I'm referring to.
But again, these don't have to come in broad packages. They come in individual lives. It could be you were born to bad parents. It could be you married a difficult person. It could be the prenatal exam discovered something in your child and you said, this is our child. We won't end its life. We will raise it, and we will, for the rest of our years, be parenting perhaps a Down syndrome child. Regular people are tested over and over and over again. And part of what I resist in this is I think the panopticon vision that is perpetuated in our culture that says the only public vision is the broad public one of a pandemic or a war. People live in quiet life. People live lives of quiet desperation for reasons that are tiny. One of my go-to illustrations of this is from Slate Star Codex, How Bad Are Things? One advantage of working in psychiatry is getting a window into otherwise invisible world of really miserable people. I work in a wealthy, mostly white college town, constantly ranked as one of the best places to live in the country. If there's anywhere that you might dare hope hasn't filled to the brim with people living hopeless lives, it would be here. But that hope is not realized. Every day I get to listen to people describe problems that would seem overwrought if they were in a novel and made up if they were a think piece in the fragmentation of American society. A perfectly average patient will be a 70-year-old woman who used to live somewhere else, but who moved a few years ago after her husband died in order to be closer to family. She has a medical condition or other that prevents her from driving or walking around much, and the family she wanted to be closer to have their own issues. So she has no friends within 500 miles, never leaves her house except to go to doctor's appointments. She has one son who's in jail, one daughter who married a drug addict. She also has one grandchild, her only remaining joy in the world. But her drug-addicted son-in-law uses access to him as a bargaining chip to make her give him money from her rapidly dwindling retirement account so she can buy drugs. When she can't cough up enough quickly enough, he bans her from visiting or talking to the grandchild, plus he tells her grandchild it's her fault. Her retirement savings are rapidly running out and she has no idea what she will do when they're gone. Probably end up on the street. Also, her dog just died. If parents were to read the above paragraph, there's a handful who would sue me for breach of confidentiality, assuming I'd just written down their medical history and gotten a couple of details like the number of children wrong. I didn't. This is a type. Here's another 60-year-old guy who was abused as a child. He still has visible scars, ran off at age 15, got a job in a factory, married, let's say, a waitress. There's some kind of explosion in his factory. He got PTSD. Now he freaks out every time he steps within 100 meters of a place where manufacturing is going on. Gradually stopped going outside because there's too many scary loud noises. His wife started yelling at him and telling him he was useless. He started beating his wife, put in jail for a year or two for domestic violence, came out. By this point, his wife has run off with another man and took everything he owned with her. Moved in with an abusive uncle who is 80 years old and hates his guts, but the uncle needed a caretaker and the guy needed a place to live, and they were each other's only affordable option. Currently lives off disability payments, but the government keeps trying to cut them off, and he keeps having to spend what little he has on a lawyer to prevent them from taking even that away. But half the time he doesn't make it to his lawyer appointment because he's too nervous about going outside. Also, he has chronic pain. He only sleeps 2 hours a night because of the nightmares, and he's tired all the time. You have the pills that fix all this, right, Doc? The ones advertised on TV. A while ago, I wrote how strongly we filter people who are like us intellectually and politically. According to Gallup polls, about 46% of Americans are creationist, not just in the sense of believing in God helped guide evolution. I mean, they think evolution is a vile atheist lie and God created humans exactly as they are right now. That's half the country. And I don't have a single one of those people in my social circle. It's not because I'm deliberately avoiding them. I'm pretty live and let live politically. I wouldn't ostracize anyone just because of their weird beliefs. And yet, even though I probably know about 150 people, I'm pretty confident that not one of them is a creationist. Odds of this happening by chance, just look at the math that he does. Approximately the chance of picking a particular atom if we are randomly selected among all the atoms on Earth. About 40% of Americans want to ban gay marriage. I think if I really stretch it, maybe 10 of my 150 friends might fall into this group. This is less astronomically unlikely. The odds are merely 1 in 100 quadrillion against. People like to talk about social bubbles, but that doesn't even begin to cover 100th quadrillion. The only metaphor that really that seems appropriate is a bizarre dark matter parallel universe. And so he goes on to this, and then he ran this script. 1% of people are in prison at any given time. This is in America, okay? This isn't even in bad places in the world. 2% of people are on probation. 1% of people are in a nursing home or hospice. 2% of people have dementia. 20% of people have chronic pain. Though this varies widely with exactly survey questions, they are not talking minor aches here. About 2/3 of people with chronic pain described as constant, and half of the people describe it as unbearable and excruciating. About 77% of people have depression at any given year. 2% of people are cognitively disabled, aka mentally retarded. 1% of people are schizophrenic. 20% of people are on food stamps. 1% of people are wheelchair bound. 7% of people are alcoholic. 7%. 0.5% of people are chronic heroin users. 5% of people are unemployed, as per the official definition, which includes only those looking for jobs. 3% of people are former workers now receiving disability payments. 1% of people experience domestic violence every year. About 10% of people were sexually abused as children, many of whom are still working through the trauma. Difficult to get statistics, but probably 20% of people were physically abused as children likewise. About 9% of people, male or female, have been raped during their lifetime. These numbers may be inflated, but then he ran the script. I ran the script 20 times to simulate 20 different people, and here's what I got. Person number one, so he says 150 people. You look at 20 people in his life, and you look at, out of every 20 people, chronic pain, alcoholic, 20 pain, none of those problems. But remember, everybody who doesn't have those problems has other problems of their own. And it might be that you're fortunate enough, or that you have sort of segmented your way, because what happens with people in pain is that we arrange our lives to avoid them because they're so annoying, because they complain all the time, because they have hard lives. And so if you're fortunate enough to live in a place where you don't have to live with such people, or you're fortunate enough to, say, have enough money so that now you live by yourself, then you show up on the loneliness charts, which Hillary Clinton wrote about in the Atlantic Monthly. So I get his point, but you don't need a war for this. This is life. Misery, you don't need to go looking for misery. It will pretty much always find you.
To its moral equivalent, yes.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well,
so it's interesting. Do we even know ourselves till we're tested?
I don't think so. Well, I think you can make a case for this biologically. Here's a case. This is quite interesting. So you might ask, why do you grow when you go somewhere new? And there's two answers to that. One is you go there and you gather more information, you talk to new people, you see new things. And so you can think about that as a constructivist response, right? Your web of knowledge, adaptive knowledge increases because you've been more places. But that's not all that happens. If you go somewhere new and you expose yourself to a challenge, then new genes, the genes that haven't turned on to encode certain proteins, turn on. And
he makes this point in his college lectures.
They flesh out your psychophysiological structure. And you could even imagine that you decided to take on a new challenge voluntarily. So that'd be part of the heroic journey. Then your biology is going to respond to that right down to the genetic level. And it's going to reveal new potential that's coded inside the genetic structure that's going to make you literally more than you are. And there's this idea that Jung talked about in relationship to the maze in the Chartres Cathedral. So imagine you go into this maze, and then you walk the 4 quadrants, and then you come to the center. And the 4 quadrants are the 4 corners of the world. And you have to pass through all the 4 corners of the world before you come to the center. And the idea there is that you have to hit yourself against all the sharp edges of the world before the full potential of what you are is manifest. And that has something to do, I would say, also with the idea of the harrowing of hell, is that you have to face death, and you have to face tyranny, and you have to face malevolence, and so that's hell at that point. And the deeper you peer into that abyss, and the more strenuously you wrestle with that, the more of you turns on. And so, and I think that's how, and then you also think, well, how could it be any other way? Why would what was within you manifest itself fully in the absence of challenge? Nothing works that way. You don't get stronger without lifting weights.
Now, what's so amazing about this is this point that Jordan just so eloquently made, which is points like this is why I keep coming back to these videos. He most reliably makes these kinds of points when he's talking about the Bible. The Bible brings it out of him, and these conversations bring it out of him. And many of us who got hooked on Jordan on the college lectures and the biblical lectures, it's exactly like the little speech, the little thing that he just gave right there. This is what we come for. And it's interesting that for the most part, when he does these conversations online with interesting people, the people who interest him, or at least his topics, they don't bring this out of him. Very few of them do. But it's in this context, in the biblical lectures, in his biblical material, that's what brings it out of him. And I think this is probably why he was such a good clinician, and why it's such a tragedy that he no longer can be a clinician because of everything that's done to him, is because this is the valuable stuff. This is the stuff that I think people couldn't get enough of. This is the stuff that took people on sort of the right and the left and stopped and looked at him. This was the Jordan that really hit that spot, and this is why I often just sort of thumb through the conversations he does, but when he does this kind of material and this kind of context forces this out of him. So again, it's sort of, this is the point that he was just making about Jung and the cathedral. This is the point that we're making about the struggles and the trials that this, in a sense, he's being tested by this group around this table, and he's being tested by the book. And so the good stuff is coming out of him in this situation.
And that leads to another question. How many people, putting aside an easy society, how many people lead a life devoid of challenges?
Well,
pretty small. They just don't acknowledge them as challenges, and therefore don't need to.
Well, challenges are difficult because, again, it's usually, I've often made the case that I don't meet saints who have never suffered. They've all been tested, and it's the testing that they overcome. And it is the trials that make us. And so again, getting back to the theodicy question that they were dealing with before, when Dennis Prager was asking, the question about, well, why weren't there plagues on Germany to save the people, to save the Jews in the Second World War? Well, one might argue that the plagues came in the bombing bays of Allied bombers. Gnats come in. That's why I'm moving my hands. But this is part of the answer to the theodicy question.
Pass the test.
Well, or they're resentful and bitter about their problems
That's
instead
right.
of seeing them as adventures and opportunities.
That's the age we live in.
Yeah.
If I'm challenged, it's the fault of someone.
Yeah. Well,
okay, but yes and no. Because in the past, people took the outs too. I don't know that as a population we're better or worse. Maybe, I don't know. You can't do that math. We can't rise above and see it. And I just know that I meet people who fail the test, and I meet people who pass the test.
and people are enticed to believe that. But what I've been so heartened by, and one of the things that people have been responding to in relationship to what I've been lecturing about as a clinician, I would say, is when you confront young people, this has especially been true of young men, with the notion that what they should do is strive to bear up underneath the heaviest responsibility they can shoulder voluntarily. They're unbelievably receptive to that idea. And it's so interesting to watch, because it's almost as if all you have to do is introduce the idea, assuming you're vaguely credible. All you have to do is introduce the idea, and it's like a crystal in a supersaturated solution. It just goes, no one ever told me that. And one of the things that's been deeply sorrowful for me is to see how much effect those ideas have on people, how quickly. And the reason it's sorrowful is because you simultaneously see how much of a lack there is of that idea in our current culture. So, but I think people are there for the call, man, and lots of them, especially.
Well, is it that the lack of the idea in the current culture? Again, I mean, we're dealing with unprecedented levels of affluence and comfort. The whole thing that I just read notwithstanding. So, in some ways, we have to level up. Again, we're never able to sort of get a picture of the whole thing.
Young people on that sort of cusp of messianic development in late adolescence, you know, when the radicals can get a hold of them and make them resentful and bitter. If you offer a better pathway forward, which is something like bear up voluntarily under the catastrophe of life because you have something to offer, right? There's this idea, in the biblical idea, that in some sense, God says this, I think he says it to Moses later, that maybe it's in the Gospels, that...
And for me, this is where I get into my Calvinism, because you watch people, and you watch people that say maybe they've been in the church, maybe they were raised in the church, and they hit that moment of crisis and they fold. Now maybe they will rise at some point in the future, you never know. But you see others, there's just no way of knowing who sort of rises to the occasion and overcomes, and who sort of wimps out and gives up.
It's required that all of the ramifications of the law manifest themselves. It's like a holy requirement. And the idea there is something like, and this is a really terrifying metaphysical idea. It's like, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there malevolence in the world? Well, maybe it's because we're not all we could be. And maybe it's incumbent on each of us, and I really mean each of us, to reveal everything that is within us. And if we revealed everything that was within us, and that would happen as a consequence of this voluntary ethical striving, if we revealed everything within us, God only knows how much hell we could dispense with. Because we have no idea what things could be like if everyone was 100% aiming up.
This might be, forgive me for, I just want to say this is so important, I think. So I remember in high school, I started an anti-cheating campaign in my grade. And I remember vividly, this is really triggering things in me. The biggest reason I had cheated on some tests in elementary school. But the biggest reason I didn't in high school was God was not particularly involved in my decision, which he would have been more so later in moral decisions. I wanted to pass the test of not cheating.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I'm just thinking, literally for the first time, maybe that's another good method of getting people to do what is good. Pass tests. Pass challenges.
Yeah, well, there is speculation.
Yes.
There's this, obviously, this scene in Job where God bets with the devil, which is a hell of a thing to do. It's like you're going to bet with the devil, and the idea is that you can tempt Job out of his moral...
Always reminds me of the movie Trading Places.
Position, and what's God up to? And I had a vision about that at one time, about God presenting man with the most vicious adversary possible. And you might think, well, why would someone do that? And the answer is something like, well, if you know that the entity that you're setting the forces of hell against, in some real sense, can triumph over that, then the positioning of the adversary is actually a call to a greater good. And I think I can't help but think that that's correct, because I can't see how what is
Again, back to the theodicy question.
best can be called out of us without us being confronted simultaneously by what is worst.
But I hope I'm not being pious, Dennis, by saying that's important, but it's a kind of mid-level test of growth. So you've mentioned responsibility or reaching our full potential of who we are. You can do that in various ways, but many of them are truly, some self-help goes some way towards that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think what you see here, the call of Moses or the call of Abraham or the call of lots of people in the scripture, the highest responsibility of all is responding in faith to God's call.
Mm-hmm, right. By definition.
By definition, the highest fulfillment. I actually just...
Well, those are all instantiations of that. And I think this, again, I mean, what Os Guinness made was sort of a Protestant move, a typical Protestant move, and I talked about it yesterday, where, well, yes, but the instantiations of it, think about David and Goliath. There's a great moment where David steps up and all Israel shrinks back, and Saul is hiding in his tents and giving David his armor and say, yeah, you go get him.
Like my own name intensely, but I was named after a writer whose most famous book is called My Utmost for His Highest.
Right.
And that's
right.
What
Well, that's the
you're saying.
proper
That's
call
calling.
of the church.
That's calling.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I don't think there's any
You've
higher.
written a book on calling.
Any higher version of that.
And it's a good book. I've read his book on calling. I read it a number of years ago. But and then Jordan gets back to, that's the call of the church. Why doesn't the church do that? And that's in a sense, Jordan is a prophetic voice challenging the church in that way.
Well, and here's something that's relevant to that too. So I know neuropharmacologically, I studied pleasure as a biological mechanism. And the intense pleasure that's associated with joy and enthusiasm, so enthusiasm is to be filled with God, theos, and theos, it's to be filled with the Spirit of God. You do not experience joy as a consequence of achieving a goal. You experience joy as a consequence of positing a goal and then noting progress towards the goal. And so a corollary of that is that the higher the goal, the more intense the joy attendant on observation of progress towards it. And so then you might say, if you wanted to maximize the possibility of hedonic expression, not to degenerate into a cheap hedonism, but to maximize it in the most real sense, and this is a Viktor Frankl idea in some fundamental senses, you pick the most noble possible goal. And that's the mountain,
And that's been the religious challenge throughout the ages.
Service to God, again, by definition, right? Because it's service to the highest thing, whatever that is. And then that opens the door, that does literally open the door to it's a precondition for the experience of joy. And so these people who are depressed and anxious and miserable, part of the reason for that is that their ethic is scattered. Their goals are diverse and low level. There's nothing beckoning in the distance, and so they can't see progress because there's no progress, and certainly not progress to a superordinate goal. So there's actually no positive emotion. And that's technically the case, because the positive emotion system is a calibration system that produces navigation orientation towards a destination point. That's literally how it functions. So.
And yet the difficulty of seeing that, I mean, again, to not beat up on our age too badly, I mean, read in the book of Ruth, Naomi goes to Moab with her husband and her sons gather wives, and everything's going great, and then her husband dies and her sons die, and the daughter-in-laws dutifully cling to her, and she says, go away from me. Don't call me Naomi, which means sweetie, call me Mara, which means bitter, because the Lord has made my life bitter. And of course, Orpah goes back to her own people, but Ruth basically says, I'll never leave you, and she goes back, and the whole story is one where God, the story ends with a bouncing grandbaby on her lap because God has filled her. And what's interesting about the story is the way that God sort of, through Ruth, just leads Naomi just one little step at a time. Here's a little more hope. Here's a little more hope. Here's a little more hope. How much hope can you take? And that's often what you have to do with people. You just have to sort of spoon feed them to just level up a little. Here's another little challenge. Can you just believe that maybe Ruth might catch Boaz's eye, and he'll be a kinsman redeemer, and he'll put even his own estate at risk to marry her, and Naomi, your line will continue through your daughter-in-law. And of course, it's a great story, and it ends in joy.
I think you just described the whole book of Exodus, just right there. Like, that's
right.
Really what Exodus is.
Yeah. Right, well, that's
like
the journey to the
scattered, mixed
yeah.
multitude that is gathered into, and you can experience that in yourself as much as in a people or in anything actually functions that way.
And
anything
that is
you can identify.
Where there is no vision of people perish.
Right,
where,
exactly.
Where the cultural norms are so degraded.
It's also the danger of dispensing with an ideal, because the problem with ideals is that every ideal is a judge. So the ideal of beauty is a judge, because who of us compares to the ideal beauty? And the answer is no one, and we all know it. And so the ideal is a catastrophe in that sense.
It's a raging fire that can consume you.
Yes, exactly. But if there's no ideal, there's no goal. And if there's no goal, then there's no joy. And so what are we going to do? We're going to dispense with our ideals so we don't hurt anybody's feelings. And what we're going to dispense, well, that's exactly what we're being called upon to do. And so we're going to abandon joy. And unless you have the ultimately judgmental ideal, it's so perverse. Unless you have the ultimately judgmental ideal, there's no precondition for joy. God.
But back to Stephen's thing about the funeral.
And again, right there, so much good stuff. The ideal, the joy, the judge, you need all the pieces in order to bring out of us who we can be.
And the reality, the history. In other words, psychology and lots of things, you can throw incredible interpretive light. But the highest thing here is that God is the actor in this, and it happens in history. So the surrounding nations, all their festivals were festivals of nature, spring and so on. The Jewish festivals are festivals of history, and they're taught to follow them as if they were there, maybe centuries later. In other words, you've got to keep always that history is the decisive thing here, and in light of history, you bring in psychology. I happen to be trained sociology, bring it in. But history and meeting God, you're into pretty heavy philosophy. Yeah.
You see here, too, that what's put in the highest place, which is so fascinating, is the spirit that calls you to freedom out of tyranny, right, as we said before, even if it calls you into the desert to begin with. And so it's quite the conceptualization of God, is that part of whatever is to be properly put in the highest place is exactly the spirit that calls you out of tyranny. And so, all right, well, let's finish off this chapter. And he said, "Draw not nigh hither." This is God talking. "Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." Again, I'm reminded of the fact that this is likely something like a call to humility. I was looking at the Sermon on the Mount the other day, and Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount that those who are poor in spirit are blessed. There's many people who are blessed, but the poor in spirit are blessed. And the question is, what does that mean? And it means something like those who have been brought low enough to be humble enough to be ready to receive. And I think that's what's being echoed here, is that that's part of the reflection of Moses' nakedness.
That's the best explanation I ever heard.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It took me only 40 years to think of that.
That really helps. Because I've never thought, oh, the poor are so special. They're
no.
The poor in spirit. I mean, Dennis, Jesus gets these all from the Old Testament.
Wonderful poor and lousy poor.
No, it's definitely a reference to pride. The poor in spirit are not prideful and narcissistic. I look in Bible Hub, which is a great site.
Right.
You can see 50 translations simultaneously,
right. Yes.
and so you get the full connotation of the phrase. And if you look at all the different translations, you can see that it's definitely a call to this particular kind of humility. Because one of the things I learned when I
We could spend a long time on the Sermon on the Mount.
was teaching my course Maps of Meaning was that you could decide that you were going to be friends with what you knew, or you could be friends with what you didn't know, right? And so if you're friends with what you know, you try to prove your point all the time. And I'll fall prey to that from time to time. But once you realize the depths of your ignorance and you think, well, what I don't know is inexhaustible, and my troubles are inexhaustible, so I better have an inexhaustible source to call on, and I can certainly call on the inexhaustibility of my own ignorance. And it reverses everything, because all of a sudden the fact that you don't know is actually your greatest hope, because there's always the possibility that if you lowered yourself, Jung said... Again, another gem right there. It's really clever. Modern men do not see God because they do not look low enough. It's so brilliant. And if you can make friends with your own ignorance, then you open up the landscape of revelation to everything you don't know. Well, that's so good if you have a problem, because the reason you have a problem is because you don't know something. And so this is definitely an injunction there, is that the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. And if you're on holy ground, and maybe you're always on holy ground, you should have your damn shoes off and your eyes open. And yeah, well, that'd be a terrifying thing to apprehend. All right, gentlemen, that was a good start. Well, these were tough. These were tough ones.
You're right. Yeah. Wait till.
No, it was an excellent start. And again, this isn't even, I think, the best of the episodes. It's a good start, but there are some upcoming episodes that are really good. But this ended strong. So, well, I got to the end of the first one. I'll see what Daily Wire has to say, or maybe, we'll see what happens if I start on episode 2 and wait and see what. The problem with YouTube is that you have things up, and things can be up for days or weeks, and then suddenly, bang, you wake up one morning, you open up, and you've got a copyright strike. It's like, well, what did that come from? That's been up for weeks, but someone found it when they hire companies to go out and check, do all the checking, and then, oh, there's Vander Clay, and he's using your video. So let me know what you think in the comment section. I always appreciate it if this is valuable, because it's time consuming. I enjoy doing it, but it's only valuable if it's valuable to you. So thank you for your time and attention.